the AIDS crisis, as it was one of the most major events of the time, and along with it kind of came a lot of these artists and activists that were just really outspoken about a lot of issues at the time. Keith Haring, born 1958 and died 1990 due to AIDS, was an artist at the time. His father was a cartoonist, which kind of made Keith kind of grow up with the arts, making him love drawing from a young age as he grew up in kind of like a small conservative town in the U.S. When Keith was about 17, he went to an art school where he was studying art, but he eventually dropped out after 2 semesters due to him pretty much not really liking others' vision on art. Others' vision on art pretty much being that, a lot of people were doing art just to have a job or to supply themselves. And Keith wanted to do art to spread his opinions and messages. So, yeah, he dropped out of school after 2 semesters and moved to New York to kind of be where the action in the art world was at the time. In New York, he was kind of struck by the graffiti artists and kind of pop culture art of the time, finding kind of a mentor figure in Andy Warhol, who some of you might know about. And moving to New York, he started to do a lot of these chalk drawings in the New York subway, just on the walls of the stations, which could be found all throughout the city. All of his artwork or not all, but a lot of his artwork at the time was protesting something. These things being like nuclear war, apartheid in South Africa, which was kind of slavery and racism related. He also protested things like capitalism and LGBTQ hate and discrimination, which was really rampant at the time. Between 1982 and 1989, Keith made more than 50 public works, all carrying different social, political, religious messages that he just wanted to get out into the world. One of the most famous being his Crack is Whack mural, as well as a mural he created for the 100th anniversary of the Statue of Liberty, where he worked with 900 school children from all around, like all places of New York, to come in and work on this project. Keith was diagnosed in 1986 with AIDS, and after this point, he began to ramp up his production of artwork, turning it like the act of creating artwork into a form of activism. Keith did not fear dying, which was kind of like his mentality, being diagnosed with AIDS. And he really chose to live his life to the fullest. He also at this time founded the Haring Foundation, which was just a support, information, and help group or foundation for those with AIDS and families of those with AIDS. He also worked with people like the ACT UP Foundation, which were also pretty apparent at the time. Through his whole life, Keith kind of pushed one main message, which was he wanted art to be accessible to everyone, no matter like what background you came from. So at some point, he opened the Pop Shop, which was this shop. You can see it in a couple of photos. Like here, and you probably can't see it, but that one there. And it was a shop that sold different merchandise like t-shirts and toys and pins and buttons with his imagery on it to kind of put just all artwork out there at a price that anyone could really afford. And a lot of this funding actually did go to things like the Haring Foundation to help support people. Keith, through his life, really just wanted to push a lot of social messages and protested a lot of things at the time, almost especially relating to AIDS. Now, the AIDS crisis was first initially kind of kickstarted in 1981 with the first public report of it becoming known, pretty much, where doctors are finding unexpectedly high levels of rare diseases, which were just very uncommon. These things were most common in homosexual men, and there was a lot of unknowns about it at the time, which initially caused mass hysteria. And now we know that HIV leads to AIDS, or acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, causes a person's immune system to kind of break down and become weaker, making a person very susceptible and weak against pretty much all sickness. Because of the initial mass hysteria, AIDS was named, or kind of given the title of a gay man's disease, which was not true. Even because of this, people like firefighters and policemen were given face masks and gloves to protect themselves against it, even though there was no way it could get transferred to them. There was a lot of fear surrounding AIDS and HIV in the 1980s and 90s, kind of pretty much globally, splitting people between sympathy and fear for those with AIDS. A thing that caused a lot of backlash and outspokenness at the time was a lack of attention from the governments of the world. Initially, there was very, very little funding due to the stigma surrounding HIV and AIDS. There was very little funding to research, which really stunted the development of any effective treatment for it. Another thing that here in the U.S. specifically caused a lot of uproar was the president at the time, Ronald Reagan, was completely silent on the issue of AIDS for his entire first term as president. A quote, Patrick Buchanan, a senior advisor to Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan, and a conservative commentator, wrote in 1984 that homosexuals, quote, have declared a war upon nature, and now nature is exacting its awful retribution. This was many people's sort of mindset at the time, which was very, very wrong, I would say, as just it kind of created this horrible stigma around those with it. And there was a lot of discrimination and hate towards those with AIDS. Like in 1985, Ryan White was a school child who was removed from his school due to having AIDS through a blood transfusion. And he then sued the school to be able to return, later returning and still dying in 1990 due to AIDS. There's also, in 1991, the basketball great Earvin Magic Johnson announced that he was living with AIDS and later died to it, which really shook a lot of people that this famous person could, have this virus. In 1987, the AIDS quilt was made, which was this huge quilt. You can see it in this photo down here and kind of a top-down shot here, which was a quilt meant to represent those who were suffering from AIDS and kind of meant to give people a perspective as to kind of just what was going on with it. It took until 1996 to develop a truly effective treatment, but this treatment in 1996 was very, very expensive, making some people just completely unable to afford it. In 2014, it was stated that 34 million people had died from AIDS. Another about 40 million were still living with it. Throughout the history of AIDS, like 1980s and 90s, there have been many people discriminated against, and hate has been pushed towards them unnecessarily, which has also grabbed the attention of all these artists and activists and protesters to kind of speak up and be vocal about the issues at the present. I chose Keith Haring and AIDS because it somewhat reminded me of the time that we're living in now, of still somewhat uncertainty, and kind of reminds me of the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, where it was a big unknown to a lot of people. But there are also just all these different artists and activists and people and protesters who are just trying to, like Keith Haring, make the world a better place through their art.